Before we dive into this incredible story of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate redemption, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comment below. And if you're ready for a story that will take you through every emotion imaginable, hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Margaret Chin had always believed in fairy tales. Not the Disney kind with talking animals and magic spells, but a real-world version where love conquers all, where dedication and devotion are rewarded, and where the person you marry becomes your partner for life through thick and thin. At 34, with her warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled and her gentle way of making everyone around her feel heard, Margaret embodied everything a loving wife should be. She had met David Harrison 12 years ago at a charity gala for underprivileged children, one of those elegant affairs where the city's elite gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves. But Margaret wasn't there for the networking or the champagne. As a pediatric nurse, she genuinely cared about the cause. She had been standing near a display of children's artwork, completely absorbed in a crayon drawing of a family holding hands, when a voice behind her said, "That one's my favorite too." David Harrison was everything Margaret's practical mind told her to be cautious about, but everything her heart told her to trust. Tall, with salt and pepper hair even in his late 20s, he carried himself with the confidence that comes from growing up with money, but also with the warmth that suggested he hadn't let privilege harden his heart. He was a rising star in corporate law, ambitious and driven, but when he looked at Margaret that night, discussing the artwork with such genuine emotion, she saw something deeper. Their courtship was a whirlwind of romantic dinners, long walks through Central Park, and conversations that stretched until dawn. David would bring her coffee during her late shifts at the hospital, complete with little notes that made her colleagues tease her about her knight in shining armor. He proposed on the anniversary of their first meeting, right in front of that same display of children's artwork, which he had somehow convinced the charity to recreate. The early years of their marriage were everything Margaret had dreamed of. David's law career flourished, and he made partner at his firm by 35, the youngest in the company's history. Margaret continued her work at the Children's Hospital, finding deep fulfillment in caring for young patients and their worried families. They bought a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, spent weekends antiquing and trying new restaurants, and talked endlessly about the children they would have someday. But success, Margaret would later realize, can be a cruel teacher. As David's career ascended to new heights, as his cases became more high-profile and his clients more wealthy and demanding, something fundamental began to shift. The man who once brought her coffee and handwritten notes started coming home later and later. The conversations that used to flow like water between them became perfunctory status updates. "How was your day?" "Fine." "Did you eat?" "Had something at the office." Margaret told herself it was temporary. All marriages go through phases. All couples face seasons of disconnection. David was under enormous pressure at work, taking on cases that could make or break his reputation. She could weather the storm. She had weathered storms before. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she waited up nights for David to come home, as she prepared his favorite meals that grew cold on the table, as she optimistically planned weekend getaways that he was always too busy to take, was that the storm hadn't just arrived. It had a name, a face, and ambitions that would soon shatter everything Margaret held dear. Vivian Blackwell was 26, blonde in a way that looks effortless but costs a fortune to maintain, and possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence that she wielded like a perfectly manicured weapon. As the daughter of a media mogul, she had grown up in a world where getting what you wanted wasn't just possible, it was expected. She had recently graduated from Columbia Law School, not because she needed to work, but because power attracted her, and law was simply another form of power. When Harrison, Mills, and Associates hired Vivian as a junior associate, it was supposed to be a routine addition to their roster. Pretty, privileged law school graduates were a dime a dozen in Manhattan. But Vivian Blackwell was not routine in any sense of the word. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to understand exactly what they wanted to hear and how they wanted to hear it. More importantly, she had an instinct for identifying the cracks in people's armor and finding ways to slip through them. David Harrison, successful as he was, carried his own set of vulnerabilities. The pressure to maintain his position as the firm's golden boy was immense. The cases were becoming more complex, the stakes higher, and the margin for error non-existent. At 46, he was beginning to feel the weight of middle age, the creeping sense that his best years might be behind him. At home, Margaret's patient understanding, once a source of comfort, had begun to feel like a reminder of all the ways he was failing to live up to his own expectations. It started innocently enough. Vivian would stay late to help David prepare for particularly challenging cases. She had a gift for legal research and an even greater gift for making David feel like the brilliant, powerful man he wanted to be, while Margaret waited at home, wondering why her husband seemed so distant. David found himself energized by conversations with Vivian about strategy, about ambition, about the intoxicating possibility of reshaping the legal landscape. "You're wasting your talent on these corporate mergers," Vivian told him one evening as they worked late in his office. "You should be taking on cases that matter, cases that people remember, cases that make history." Margaret would have encouraged David's ambitions too, but she would have done it with gentle questions about whether he was happy, whether the stress was worth it, whether maybe they should think about starting a family soon. Vivian's encouragement came with no conditions, no underlying concerns about work-life balance or David's well-being. It was pure, undiluted validation of a professional identity. The first time David stayed out all night, claiming he was working on a brief that couldn't wait until morning, Margaret felt a chill of recognition she couldn't quite name. She had seen this pattern before, in friends' marriages, in the whispered conversations of nurses who worked the night shift. But David wasn't that kind of man. David was her husband, her partner, the man who proposed in front of children's artwork because he knew it would make her cry happy tears. Margaret began to notice other changes. David's wardrobe became sharper, more expensive. He started going to a different barber, one who charged 3 times as much as his old one. He bought a new car, a sleek BMW that was completely impractical for city driving, but perfect for making an impression. When Margaret asked about these changes, David dismissed her concerns with increasing irritation. "I'm a partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, Margaret. I need to look the part." "You've always looked perfect to me," she would reply, and David would soften for a moment, almost as if remembering something he had forgotten. But those moments of connection became rarer and rarer. David's phone, which had once been casually left on kitchen counters and coffee tables, became a permanent extension of his hand. He would smile at text messages in ways that made Margaret's stomach clench with unspoken dread. When she walked into a room where he was talking on the phone, he would quickly end the conversation or step outside. The Margaret of 12 years ago might have confronted him directly, demanded answers, forced the conversation that needed to happen. But the Margaret of today had been worn down by months of subtle rejection, by the gradual erosion of intimacy that happens so slowly you don't realize it's happening until it's almost complete. She found herself walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfect wife, as if by being understanding enough, supportive enough, she could somehow win back the man she had married. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, staying late at the hospital, picking up extra shifts, anything to avoid the empty house where David's absence felt like a physical ache. Her colleagues began to worry about her. Sarah, her closest friend at the hospital and a fellow nurse, finally confronted her during a rare lunch break. "Marg, what's going on with you? You're working yourself into the ground, and you look like you haven't slept in weeks." Margaret stirred her coffee absently, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded her of storm clouds. "David's been really busy with work. Big cases, you know. I'm just trying to stay busy, too." Sarah had been married for 15 years and divorced for 3. She recognized the signs. "Honey, when was the last time you and David went out together? When was the last time he asked about your day and actually listened to the answer?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow because she couldn't remember. She literally could not remember the last time she and David had shared a genuine moment of connection. "Marriage is seasons," Margaret said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "This is just a difficult season." Sarah reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Some seasons turn into climate change, Marg. Promise me you'll pay attention." That night, Margaret decided to surprise David with his favorite dinner, lamb with rosemary potatoes, the meal she had made for their first anniversary and every anniversary since. She left work early, stopped at the gourmet market, and spent 2 hours cooking. She set the table with their wedding china, lit candles, and put on the dress David had once said made her look like an angel. David came home at nearly 10 o'clock, reeking of expensive perfume that wasn't Margaret's brand, and carrying himself with the loose-limbed satisfaction of a man who had spent his evening being thoroughly appreciated by someone who wasn't his wife. "What's all this?" he asked, looking at the cold dinner, the burned-down candles, the carefully set table as if it were an accusation. "I want to surprise you," Margaret said, her voice bright with forced cheer. "I made your favorite." David loosened his tie and rubbed his face wearily. "I already ate. Big client dinner. I told you about it this morning." Margaret knew he hadn't told her anything that morning. He had left before she woke up, the same pattern he had established over the past several months. But confronting him would mean admitting that they barely spoke anymore, that their marriage had become a careful dance of avoidance and polite fiction. "Of course," she said softly. "I must have forgotten." David disappeared upstairs without another word, leaving Margaret to clean up the elaborate meal by herself. As she scraped the untouched lamb into the garbage disposal, she caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window, a woman in her 30s. Still beautiful, but with shadows under her eyes and a defeated slope to her shoulders that she didn't remember acquiring. The next morning, David was gone before dawn again, leaving only a note about a business trip that would keep him away for 3 days. Margaret crumpled the note and threw it away, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed it out, as if the act of destroying it would somehow make everything worse. She didn't know that David's business trip was actually a long weekend in the Hamptons with Vivian, at her father's estate. She didn't know that while she was covering extra shifts at the hospital to keep herself from thinking too much, David and Vivian were walking on the beach, talking about their future together, and laughing about the naive little nurse who still believed in fairy tale endings. But she was about to find out. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by courier to their brownstone with all the ceremony of a royal decree. The envelope was heavy cream-colored stock with embossed gold lettering. "Harrison Mills and Associates cordially invites you to our annual summer gala and award ceremony." Margaret had attended the firm's summer gala for the past 8 years. It was always the same elegant affair: cocktails, dinner, speeches about the firm's achievements, and awards for various categories of excellence. David usually won something. He was the firm's most successful partner, after all. Margaret would wear her one really good dress, smile politely at conversations about cases she couldn't discuss and people she barely knew, and feel proud watching David accept whatever honor they bestowed on him that year. This year felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly why. David mentioned the gala in passing, with none of his usual enthusiasm about the event or interest in what Margaret planned to wear. When she asked if he wanted to coordinate their outfits, he shrugged and said she should wear whatever made her happy. Margaret spent weeks planning for the gala anyway, perhaps sensing on some subconscious level that it would be important. She bought a new dress, navy blue silk that brought out her eyes and fit her perfectly. She made an appointment at the salon for the day of the event. She even bought new shoes, the kind of impractical heels that she never wore, but that made her feel elegant and sophisticated. On the morning of the gala, David was even more distracted than usual. He spent an hour on the phone in his study with the door closed, speaking in low, urgent tones. When Margaret knocked to ask if he wanted breakfast, he waved her away without even looking up. "I'll grab something on the way," he called through the door. Margaret stood in the hallway outside his study, listening to the muffled sound of his voice, and felt a premonition so strong it made her knees weak. Something was going to happen tonight, something that would change everything. She just had no idea how right she was. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel sparkled like something out of a dream that was about to become a nightmare. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls draped in ivory silk, while 500 of Manhattan's legal elite mingled beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds. Margaret Chen Harrison stood near the bar, her navy silk dress catching the light as she nursed a glass of champagne. She was too nervous to actually drink. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way David had barely spoken to her during the car ride to the hotel, in the way he kept checking his phone with barely concealed excitement, in the way he seemed to be scanning the crowd as if looking for someone specific. After 12 years of marriage, Margaret had learned to read the subtle signs of her husband's moods, but tonight she couldn't decipher what she was seeing. "Margaret, you look absolutely stunning." Janet Mills, wife of the firm's senior partner, appeared beside her with the kind of warm smile that Margaret had always found comforting at these events. Janet was in her 60s, silver-haired and gracious, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's names and always asked about Margaret's work at the Children's Hospital. "Thank you, Janet. You look beautiful as always." Margaret managed a genuine smile, grateful for the familiar face. "Have you seen David?" He disappeared the moment we walked in. Something flickered across Janet's expression, a shadow of discomfort that she quickly masked with another smile. "Oh, you know how these things are. The partners always get pulled into business conversations before the ceremony even starts. He'll find you when they're ready to begin." But Margaret caught the way Janet's eyes avoided hers, the slight tension in her voice that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Before Margaret could probe further, Janet had excused herself and melted back into crowd, leaving Margaret alone with her growing sense of unease. The ballroom continued to fill with familiar faces from previous galas, but Margaret noticed something different about the energy tonight. Conversation seemed more charged, more urgent. People kept glancing toward the front of the room where a small stage had been set up, flanked by enormous floral arrangements. There was an undercurrent of anticipation that felt different from the usual corporate celebration atmosphere. Mrs. Harrison? A young server appeared at her elbow with a champagne flute on a silver tray. Compliments of your husband. He asked me to tell you that the ceremony will begin shortly, and you should find your seat at table 1. Margaret accepted the champagne with a polite thank you, though her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to consider drinking it. Table 1 was always reserved for the senior partners and their spouses, the place of honor closest to the stage. She had sat there for 8 years running, watching David accept awards and accolades, feeling proud to be his wife. Tonight, as she made her way to the front of the ballroom, that familiar pride felt different. Hollow, somehow, performative. She took her seat at the elegantly appointed table, noting that David's chair remained empty. Around her, the wives of other senior partners made polite conversation about summer vacation plans and charity fundraisers, but Margaret found it difficult to focus on their words. Her attention kept drifting to the stage, to the way the lighting had been arranged, to the unusual number of photographers positioned around the room. This wasn't just the annual award ceremony. This was something bigger. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats, we're ready to begin this evening's program. The voice belonged to Richard Mills, the firm's managing partner, and it carried the authoritative tone that had made him one of New York's most formidable lawyers. The ballroom gradually quieted as 500 guests settled into their chairs. Margaret's heart began to race as she realized David still hadn't appeared. His empty chair beside her felt like a glaring absence, a question mark that made her palms sweat despite the air conditioning. Welcome, friends and colleagues, to Harrison, Mills and Associates' annual summer gala. Richard continued from the podium. Tonight is always a special evening for us, a chance to celebrate not just our professional achievements, but the people who make those achievements possible. Our attorneys, our staff, and of course, the families who support us through the long hours and difficult cases that define our practice. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Margaret clapped automatically, her eyes still scanning the room for David. Where was he? This year, however, we have a particularly unique celebration to share with you all. As you know, our firm has always prided itself on recognizing excellence in all its forms. We celebrate legal excellence, professional excellence, and tonight we're honored to celebrate something equally important, personal excellence, the excellence of character, of beauty, of the qualities that make someone truly exceptional. Margaret's blood began to turn cold. Something in Richard's tone, in the way he was building up to whatever came next, sent warning signals racing through her nervous system. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our host for this evening's special ceremony, partner David Harrison. The spotlight swung to stage left, and David emerged from behind a curtain, resplendent in a tuxedo that Margaret had never seen before. He looked more handsome than she had seen him in months. His hair perfectly styled, his smile radiant with confidence and excitement. The crowd erupted in applause, and David basked in for a moment before approaching the microphone. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. David hadn't mentioned hosting anything. He hadn't mentioned a special ceremony. What was happening? Thank you all for being here tonight, David began, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. When Richard asked me to host this portion of our evening, I was honored beyond words. You see, tonight we're not just celebrating professional achievements. Tonight, we're celebrating something far more profound, the recognition of true beauty. Margaret felt the world begin to tilt. Around her, the other wives were leaning forward with interest, but she caught several of them glancing in her direction with expressions she couldn't quite read. Pity? Embarrassment? Anticipation? Beauty, David continued, is not just about appearance, though that certainly plays a role. True beauty is about intelligence, ambition, the kind of radiance that comes from someone who is completely comfortable in their own skin and confident in their ability to achieve whatever they set their mind to. Margaret's hands began to shake. She clasped them together in her lap, her champagne glass forgotten, on the table beside her. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. For too many years, I think many of us have settled for conventional definitions of beauty, for safe choices that don't challenge us or inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. Tonight, I want to challenge those conventions. The ballroom was so quiet that Margaret could hear the software of the air conditioning, the barely audible whisper fabric as 500 guests collectively held their breath. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce someone who embodies everything I've just described. Someone who represents the future of our profession, the evolution of what it means to be a powerful, beautiful, accomplished woman in today's world. Margaret stopped breathing entirely. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the woman I am proud to crown as this year's most beautiful, Miss Vivian Blackwell. The spotlight shifted to stage right, and Margaret's world imploded. Vivian Blackwell emerged from behind the opposite curtain like something from a red carpet fantasy. Her blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves over one shoulder. Her figure would showcase a devastating effect in a silver gown that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months, and she moved with a kind of predatory grace that spoke of absolute confidence in her own power. But it wasn't Vivian's appearance that sent Margaret into shock. It was the way David looked at her. It was the expression of pure, unadulterated adoration on his face as he watched Vivian approach the microphone. It was the way the entire room seemed to fade away for him, as if nothing and no one else existed in that moment except the blonde goddess in the silver dress. Margaret had seen that expression before. She had seen it 12 years ago, when David proposed to her in front of the children's artwork. She had seen it on their wedding day, when she walked down the aisle. She had seen it in quiet moments throughout their marriage, when David looked at her with complete and total love. Now he was looking at another woman that way, in front of 500 people, at a public event, with Margaret sitting 20 feet away, wearing her navy silk dress and her new shoes and her carefully styled hair, watching her husband fall in love with someone else in real time. "Thank you, David," Vivian said into the microphone, her voice honey and steel. "And thank you all for this incredible honor. When David first told me about tonight's ceremony, I was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness, his generosity, and his courage in recognizing that beauty comes in many forms." Margaret felt like she was drowning. The words were washing over her without meaning, but she could see the guests at her table shifting uncomfortably, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an award ceremony. This was a public humiliation. This was David's way of announcing to their entire professional and social circle that he had found someone better, someone younger, more beautiful, more accomplished, someone worthy of being crowned in front of everyone they knew. "I want to thank David not just for this recognition, but for showing me what it means to be truly appreciated," Vivian continued. "For seeing not just my professional potential, but everything I have to offer as a woman, as a partner, as someone who shares his vision for the future." Partner. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Vivian wasn't just talking about professional partnership. She was staking a claim, right there in front of everyone, on Margaret's husband. The ceremony continued around Margaret like a fever dream. David presented Vivian with a crystal tiara, an actual tiara, like she was being crowned Miss America, while a crowd applauded and photographers captured every moment. Vivian gave a speech about ambition and modern womanhood, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who recognize your worth. David beamed at her, like she was delivering the Gettysburg Address. Through it all, Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her face carefully composed in what she hoped looked like polite interest rather than complete devastation. Years of nursing had taught her to maintain her professional demeanor in crisis situations, and she drew on every ounce of that training now to keep from falling apart in public. But inside, she was screaming. The ceremony concluded with David and Vivian posing for photograph together, the crystal tiara catching the light as cameras flashed. They looked perfect together, the distinguished older man and the radiant younger woman, both beautiful, both successful, both glow with the kind of confidence that comes from getting everything you want. Margaret excused herself from her table as the crowd began to mingle again, murmuring congratulations and discussing what they had just witnessed. She moved through the ballroom like a ghost, smiling automatically at people who spoke to her, nodding at conversations she couldn't process, making her way toward the ladies' room where she could finally fall apart in private. But she didn't make it that far. Margaret. David's voice stopped her near the ballroom entrance. She turned slowly, dreading what she would see on his face. He looked guilty, but also defiant, like a child who knows he's done something wrong, but isn't sorry enough to stop doing it. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Margaret looked back at the ballroom, at the crowd still buzzing with excitement over the evening's surprise ceremony, at Vivian holding court near the stage with her crystal tiara and her silver dress and her complete and total victory. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think we do." But tonight wasn't the night for that conversation. Tonight was a night for Margaret to understand, with perfect and devastating clarity, that her marriage was over, that the man she had loved for 12 years, the man she had supported through every triumph and setback, the man she had built her entire adult life around, had chosen someone else, and he had chosen to tell her, and everyone else they knew, in the most public, humiliating way possible. Margaret Chun Harrison walked out of the Plaza Hotel that night with her head held high and her heart completely shattered, not knowing that this moment of ultimate betrayal would become the catalyst for a transformation that would surprise everyone, including herself. The fairy tale was over. But sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of another. What did you think about David's devastating betrayal? Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated so publicly? And more importantly, what do you think Margaret should do next? Let me know in the comments. And if you're invested in finding out how this story unfolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Margaret's journey is just beginning. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered with the same ceremonial flourish as the gala invitation 3 months earlier. Margaret stared at the thick envelope bearing the letterhead of Whitman and Associates, not David's firm, but their biggest competitor, and felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. Even in dissolving their marriage, David was making a statement about power and position. The papers were clinical in their cruelty. Irreconcilable differences was a phrase they used, as if 12 years of marriage could be reduced to a legal term that absolved everyone of responsibility. David was requesting division of assets, including their Brooklyn Heights brownstone, and offering Margaret what his lawyers probably considered generous alimony, enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, enough to keep her quiet, enough to assuage whatever guilt he might still possess. Margaret set the papers on her kitchen table, the same table where she had waited so many nights for David to come home, where she had eaten countless cold dinners alone, and made the first truly autonomous decision she had made in months. She called in sick to work, poured herself a large glass of wine despite the fact that it wasn't even noon, and allowed herself exactly 24 hours to fall completely apart. She cried until her eyes swelled shut. She screamed into pillows until her voice gave out. She looked through photo albums and wedding videos and love letters that David had written her in the early years, torturing herself with evidence of what they had once been. She ate an entire pint of ice cream for dinner and threw David's favorite coffee mug against the kitchen wall, watching it shatter into pieces as she left scattered on the floor like confetti from the world's worst party. But when she woke up the next morning, surrounded by tissues and empty wine bottles and the debris of her emotional breakdown, Margaret Chun Harrison made a decision that would change everything. She was done being a victim. The Margaret who had sat frozen at that table in the Plaza Hotel, watching her husband crown another woman in front of everyone they knew, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone angrier, someone who had finally realized that the fairy tale ending she had been waiting for was never going to come. If she wanted a happy ending, she was going to have to write it herself. Her first call was to Linda Rodriguez, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Manhattan. Linda had a reputation for destroying cheating husbands with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a shark. Her consultation fee alone was more than Margaret made in a week, but Margaret didn't care. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about justice. Mrs. Harrison, Linda said when they met in her sleek Midtown office, "I'm going to be direct with you. Your husband's attorneys are clearly hoping you'll accept their initial offer out of embarrassment or a desire to avoid a messy court battle. That would be a mistake." Linda was in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp suit that screamed competence and authority. She had built her career on representing women who had been discarded by powerful men, and she had zero patience for anyone who wanted to roll over and play dead. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked. "I'm suggesting we make Mr. Harrison's life very uncomfortable. The brownstone was purchased before the marriage, but you contributed 12 years of mortgage payments, improvements, and maintenance. The retirement accounts were built during your marriage with joint contributions. The art collection, the wine cellar, the vacation home in the Hamptons, all marital assets, regardless of whose name is on the paperwork." Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months: power. For so long, she felt like a passenger in her own life, watching helplessly as David made decisions that affected their future without consulting her. Now, finally, she had some control. "And Mrs. Harrison," Linda continued, "I believe we should also discuss the circumstances surrounding your separation. A public affair, conducted in front of professional colleagues, resulting in deliberate humiliation of a spouse, can have significant implications in New York divorce law." The next 6 months were a masterclass in warfare, disguised as legal proceedings. Linda's team dissected David and Margaret's financial life with forensic precision, uncovering assets that David had tried to hide, tracing spending patterns that revealed the full extent of his relationship with Vivian, and building a case that painted David as a man who had systematically betrayed his marriage vows while emotionally and financially abusing his wife. But Margaret wasn't content to simply fight David in court. She had spent 12 years defining herself as David Harrison's wife, and now she needed to figure out who Margaret Chun could become on her own. She started by going back to school. The pediatric nursing certification she had earned years earlier was still valuable, but Margaret had always dreamed of becoming a nurse practitioner, of having the authority to diagnose and treat patients rather than simply following doctors' orders. She enrolled in a master's program at NYU, taking night classes while maintaining her full-time job at the hospital. The workload was crushing. Between her shifts at the children's hospital, her graduate coursework, and the endless meetings with lawyers and accountants, Margaret was operating on 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night. Her friends worried that she was pushing herself too hard, that she was using exhaustion as a way to avoid processing the trauma of her divorce. They were probably right, but Margaret didn't care. Every hour spent studying pharmacology or pediatric pathology was an hour. She wasn't thinking about David and Vivian. Every exam she aced was proof that she was more than just someone's discarded wife. Every clinical rotation where she successfully diagnosed a difficult case or comforted a frightened family was evidence that she had value independent of her marriage. Sarah, her friend from the hospital, confronted her one evening as Margaret sat in the break room, textbooks spread across the table, trying to memorize drug interactions while eating a vending machine dinner. "Marg, I'm worried about you. When was the last time you went home before midnight? When was the last time you did something just because it was fun?" Margaret looked up from her pharmacology notes, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but blazing with determination. "I'm fine, Sarah. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it." "You're killing yourself." "No," Margaret said quietly, closing her textbook and meeting Sarah's concerned gaze. "I'm saving myself. David spent years making me feel like I was lucky to be chosen by him, like I should be grateful that someone like him would settle for someone like me. I'm done feeling grateful for scraps of affection from men who don't deserve me." Sarah studied her friend's face, thinner than it had been 6 months ago, but somehow more beautiful. There was a strength in Margaret's features that hadn't been there during her marriage, a confidence that came from testing herself and discovering she was stronger than she had ever imagined. "You're right," Sarah said finally, "but promise me you'll take care of yourself too, okay? The world needs more nurse practitioners, but it needs Margaret healthy and whole." Margaret smiled, the first genuinely happy smile Sarah had seen from her in almost a year. "I promise." As winter turned to spring, Margaret's life began to take on a new rhythm. She was excelling in her graduate program, earning the respect of professors and classmates who recognized her combination of clinical experience and academic brilliance. Her divorce proceedings were going better than anyone had expected, with Linda systematically dismantling David's attempts to minimize Margaret's contributions to their marriage. But the real transformation was happening inside Margaret herself. The woman who had spent 12 years trying to be the perfect wife, who had apologized for existing and made herself smaller to accommodate David's ego, was gone. In her place was someone who spoke up in class, who challenged attending physicians when she disagreed with their treatment plans, who looked at herself in the mirror each morning and saw someone worthy of respect. The first time Margaret ran into someone from David's firm, Janet Mills, at a coffee shop near the hospital, she was surprised by her own reaction. Instead of the shame and embarrassment she had expected to feel, Margaret found herself standing straighter, speaking more confidently. "Margaret, dear, how are you holding up?" Janet asked, her voice full of the careful sympathy reserved for the recently divorced. "I'm wonderful, actually," Margaret replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "I'm finishing my master's degree in pediatric nursing. I'll be graduating in December." Janet's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "That's fantastic. I had no idea you were pursuing further education. There's a lot about me that people didn't know," Margaret said with a smile that contained just a hint of steel. "I'm discovering that myself." As Margaret spoke about her studies, her plans to specialize in pediatric oncology, her research project on pain management in children with chronic illnesses, she watched Janet's expression change from pity to respect. This wasn't the quiet, self-effacing wife who had sat silently at firm dinners for 8 years. This was a woman with her own ambitions, her own expertise, her own value that had nothing to do with her relationship to any man. "Well," Janet said when Margaret finished describing her career plans, "David certainly doesn't know what he's lost, does he?" Margaret's smile widened. "No, I don't think he does. But that's his problem now, not mine." The conversation stayed with Margaret for days, not because of what Janet had said, but because of how Margaret had felt saying it. For the first time since the night at the Plaza Hotel, Margaret felt genuinely proud of herself. Not because someone else was praising her, not because she had succeeded at being what someone else wanted her to be, but because she was becoming the person she had always had the potential to become. Spring turned to summer, and Margaret's divorce was finalized in a conference room that felt nothing like the courtroom dramas she had imagined. Linda had negotiated a settlement that left Margaret with half of everything: the brownstone, which she immediately sold, half of David's retirement accounts, and ongoing alimony that would allow her to focus on her studies without worrying about money. More importantly, Linda had insisted on a clause that prevented David from speaking publicly about their marriage or divorce. No interviews, no statements to the press, no opportunities for him to rewrite history in his favor. "You've won more than money," Linda told Margaret as they signed the final papers. "You've won your freedom and your dignity. Use them well." Margaret graduated from her master's program in December with a 4.0 GPA and job offers from 3 of the city's most prestigious pediatric hospitals. She accepted a position at Memorial Sloan Kettering's Pediatric Oncology Unit, working with children fighting cancer and their families navigating the most difficult experience of their lives. It was heartbreaking work, but also deeply meaningful in ways that Margaret's previous nursing job, as much as she had loved it, had never been. She was no longer just following orders or providing comfort. She was making medical decisions, developing treatment plans, serving as the bridge between frightened families and complex medical realities. The scared, diminished woman who had sat in that Plaza Hotel ballroom, watching her husband crown another woman, was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and more accomplished than Margaret had ever dared to dream she could be. She had no way of knowing that this transformation, this success, this newfound confidence and recognition would soon bring her face to face with the man who had tried to destroy her, and that when that confrontation came, she would be ready for it in ways that would surprise everyone, including herself. While Margaret was building her new life from the ashes of her marriage, David Harrison was discovering that getting everything you think you want can sometimes be the worst thing that ever happens to you. The first year after the divorce had felt like a victory lap. David moved out of Brooklyn Heights brownstone before Margaret could claim it in the settlement, renting a spectacular penthouse apartment in Tribeca that screamed success and sophistication. The place was all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern art, the kind of bachelor pad that appeared in architectural magazines, and made visitors feel like they were witnessing how the other half lived. Vivian had moved in almost immediately, transforming the space into something that looked like a movie set. She had exquisite taste and unlimited access to her father's money, and she used both to create an environment that announced to everyone who entered that they were in the presence of serious power and wealth. For David, those first months felt like a renaissance. He was 58 years old and felt 25. He had traded his comfortable, predictable marriage for something electric and unpredictable. Vivian challenged him intellectually, matched his ambition, and made him feel like a successful, desirable man he had always believed himself to be. At the firm, their relationship was a subject of constant speculation and gossip, but David told himself that was just jealousy. His colleagues were married to women who had grown comfortable and complacent, who had let themselves go and stopped trying to be interesting. They envied him for having the courage to pursue something better. Vivian's legal work was exceptional, as David had expected. She was brilliant, ruthless, and unencumbered by the kind of sentimental concerns that held back less ambitious attorneys. She won cases that other lawyers might have lost, not because she was more knowledgeable, but because she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve victory. But brilliance and ruthlessness, David was slowly learning, could be double-edged swords. The first sign of trouble came during their second year together, when David noticed that Vivian had very little interest in spending time with him outside of work-related activities. She loved attending legal conferences, client dinners, and firm events where they could be seen together as a power couple. But quiet evenings at home, weekend getaways to places where they wouldn't encounter professional colleagues, intimate dinners at restaurants where they couldn't network, these held no appeal for her. "I don't understand why you want to go to some little bistro in Brooklyn when we could be having dinner with the partners from Goldman Sachs," she would say when David suggested they spend time together away from the legal world. David told himself that Vivian's focus on their careers was one of the things he admired about her. Margaret had always wanted him to relax, to stop working, to focus on their personal relationship in ways that had felt suffocating. Vivian understood that their professional success was a foundation of everything else. But as time went on, David began to feel less like Vivian's partner and more like her career accessory. She was interested in him when he could introduce her to important clients, when he could bring her into high-stakes negotiations, when his reputation could open doors for her advancement. When those opportunities weren't present, her attention wandered. The second sign of trouble was more subtle, but ultimately more devastating. David began to notice that Vivian's loyalty was entirely conditional. She supported his decisions when they aligned with her interests, but when they didn't, She had no hesitation about undermining him. It started with small things. David would propose a case strategy in a partner's meeting, and Vivian would publicly suggest modifications that made her look more innovative and him look outdated. She would volunteer for high-profile assignments that David had been considering, positioning herself as the fresh talent the firm needed to stay competitive. David convinced himself that this was just healthy professional competition. Vivian was ambitious. That was one of the things that attracted him to her. He didn't want a wife who was content to live in his shadow. He wanted a partner who could challenge him and push him to be better. But Vivian's version of partnership looked increasingly like a zero-sum game where her advancement came at David's expense. The third sign of trouble was the most painful to acknowledge. David realized that Vivian was embarrassed by his age and social situations where their relationship couldn't be framed as a professional mentorship. At firm events, where their relationship made sense within the context of senior partner and rising associate, Vivian was warm and attentive. But at social gatherings with people their own age, where the 22-year age gap became glaringly obvious, she grew distant and irritable. David caught her rolling her eyes when he mentioned movies or music from the 1980s. She made jokes about his old-fashioned preferences in restaurants, books, and vacation destinations. She started suggesting that he update his wardrobe, his haircut, his car, as if she could somehow make him young enough to be the peer she wanted rather than the older man he was. I have to ask, do you believe in karma? Do you think people who betray others eventually get what's coming to them? Drop a quick yes in the comments if you think David is about to learn that actions have consequences. The beginning of David's real downfall started with a case that should have been his greatest triumph. Harrison, Mills and Associates was retained to represent Meridian Pharmaceuticals in a class-action lawsuit involving a pediatric medication that had allegedly caused serious side effects in children. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-visibility case that could define a lawyer's career. David had been preparing for the case for months, developing a defense strategy that focused on challenging the scientific evidence linking Meridian's drug to the reported side effects. It was complex work requiring deep understanding of both legal precedent and medical research, exactly the kind of intellectual challenge that had made David fall in love with law in the first place. But as the case developed, David began to uncover evidence that Meridian had known about potential side effects and had failed to disclose them to the FDA. Internal company documents showed that their researchers had identified risks but had been overruled by executives who were concerned about the drug's profitability. For the first time in his career, David found himself representing a client who was clearly in the wrong. Not just technically wrong, but morally wrong. The pediatric medication in question was being used to treat children with severe chronic illnesses, and the side effect that Meridian had covered up were causing permanent damage to kids who were already facing enormous health challenges. David's conscience, dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed, suddenly roared to life. These were children. Sick children whose parents trusted doctors and pharmaceutical companies to prioritize their well-being over profit margins. How could he stand in a courtroom and argue that Meridian bore no responsibility for hiding information that could have prevented unnecessary suffering? He shared his concerns with Vivian, expecting her to understand his moral dilemma and perhaps help him find a way to handle the case that didn't compromise his integrity. Vivian's response was swift and brutal. Are you seriously considering sabotaging the biggest case of your career because you suddenly develop a conscience? David, we're lawyers, not social workers. Our job is to represent our client's interests, not to play judge and jury about whether they deserve to win. These are children, Vivian. Sick children whose health was put at risk by a company that cared more about money than safety. And their families will be compensated appropriately when we lose the case, which we inevitably will if the evidence is as damning as you say. But our obligation is to provide the best possible defense, not to roll over because you're feeling sentimental about pediatric patients. David stared at Vivian, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had left his wife for, was completely unmoved by the suffering of children, if acknowledging that suffering interfered with her professional advancement. What happened to you? He asked quietly. How did you become someone who can dismiss the well-being of sick kids as sentimentality? Vivian's eyes flashed with anger. I became someone who understands that the world is not a fairy tale, David. I became someone who knows that success requires making difficult choices and not apologizing for them. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. The threat was unmistakable. Support the case strategy or lose her. Choose professional success over moral qualms or be abandoned. David realized with sickening clarity that he was facing the same kind of ultimatum that he'd given Margaret, except this time he was on the receiving end. Compromise your values or lose the person you love. Except Margaret had never asked him to compromise his values. She had only asked him to remember that she existed. For the first time since leaving his wife, David found himself wondering what Margaret would say if she knew about the Meridian case. Margaret, who had devoted her career to caring for sick children. Margaret, who would be horrified by the idea of prioritizing pharmaceutical company profits over pediatric patient safety. Margaret, who had loved him unconditionally for 12 years and had never once asked him to choose between his conscience and their relationship. David withdrew from the Meridian case, claiming a conflict of interest. It was professional suicide, and everyone knew it. You don't walk away from a case worth millions in billable hours without damaging your reputation and your standing at the firm. Vivian was furious, but her anger was cold and calculating rather than emotional. She didn't scream or cry or plead with him to reconsider. She simply began to distance herself from him professionally and personally, making it clear that she considered his decision a sign of weakness that she couldn't respect or tolerate. Within 6 months, Vivian had been assigned to work primarily with other partners. Within a year, she had been promoted to senior associate and was being groomed for a partnership track. Within 18 months, she had ended their relationship with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to her legal work. "This isn't working anymore, David," she told him over dinner at the same restaurant where they had celebrated his divorce being finalized. "We want different things. You're looking for some kind of meaningful connection, and I'm focused on building my career. We're just not compatible." David felt the world tilt beneath him, the same disorienting sensation Margaret must have felt when she realized her marriage was over. But this time, there was no gradual decline, no months of warning signs. Vivian ended their relationship like she was terminating a business contract that was no longer profitable. "What about everything we built together? What about our plans for future?" Vivian's smile was polite but distant, the expression she probably used with opposing counsel during settlement negotiations. "We didn't build anything together, David. We had a mutually beneficial arrangement that has run its course. You helped advance my career, and I helped you feel young and relevant again. But I don't need your help anymore, and frankly, you're starting to hold me back." The cruelty of it took David's breath away. Not just the ending, but the casual dismissal of everything he had thought they shared. According to Vivian, their entire relationship had been transactional, a career strategy disguised as love. "I left my wife for you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Vivian replied, gathering her purse and standing to leave. "You left your wife for yourself because you were bored and wanted something more exciting. I was just the excuse you used to blow up your life. That's not my responsibility, David. That's yours." She left him sitting alone at their table, surrounded by the debris of the dinner they would never finish and the relationship that had cost him everything he had once valued. The months that followed were the darkest of David's life. His professional reputation was in ruins after his withdrawal from the Meridian case. His personal life was non-existent. He had sacrificed his marriage for a woman who had never actually loved him. His colleagues at the firm treated him with a kind of polite distance reserved for partners who were being quietly encouraged to retire. David's penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success and sophistication, began to feel like a prison. The modern art and expensive furniture that Vivian had chosen seemed cold and impersonal without her presence to animate them. He found himself eating takeout alone most nights, surrounded by the evidence of a lifestyle that had been designed to impress other people rather than provide genuine comfort or happiness. For the first time in decades, David had time to think about what he had done and who he had become, without the constant demands of high-stakes legal work. Without Vivian's presence to distract him from uncomfortable truths, David was forced to confront the reality of his choices. He had destroyed a 12-year marriage to a woman who had loved him unconditionally. He had humiliated Margaret in front of everyone they knew, not because she had done anything wrong, but because he had been selfish and cruel and stupid enough to believe that love was something you could trade up for like a car or a house. He had sacrificed his professional integrity for a woman who had never respected him, who had seen him as a stepping stone to be used and discarded when he was no longer useful. And now he was alone, with no one to blame but himself. The final blow came on a cold February morning when David opened the New York Times to find an article about emerging research in pediatric oncology. The article featured a photograph of a confident, beautiful woman in a white coat standing next to a young patient who was smiling despite being bald from chemotherapy treatments. The woman in the photograph was Margaret, his ex-wife, the woman he had betrayed and discarded and publicly humiliated. The article described groundbreaking research that Margaret had conducted, work that was saving the lives of children with cancer. She was quoted extensively, speaking with passion and expertise about her discoveries and their implications for pediatric treatment. The article portrayed her as a rising star in her field, a brilliant researcher whose work was making a real difference in the world. David read the article 3 times, his hands shaking as he absorbed the magnitude of what Margaret had accomplished. While he had been playing house with a woman who had never loved him, while he had been compromising his principles and destroying his reputation, Margaret had been rebuilding her life into something meaningful and important. She was saving children's lives. She was conducting research that would help other healthcare professionals do their jobs better. She was making discoveries that would benefit families facing the worst experience imaginable. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her, their divorce, his betrayal, and turned it into fuel for becoming the person she had always been meant to be. David folded the newspaper carefully and sat in his empty penthouse, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just a marriage, but a partnership with someone who had genuinely cared about making the world better. Someone who had loved him not because of what he could do for her career, but because of who he was as a person. Someone who had deserved so much better than what he had given her. For the first time since the night of the Plaza Hotel Gala, David cried. Not for himself, not for his ruined career or his failed relationship with Vivian, but for Margaret, for the pain he had caused her, for the humiliation he had put her through, for the years of love and devotion he had taken for granted and thrown away. He had no way of knowing that fate was about to give him an opportunity to face the woman he had wronged, or that when that moment came, he would finally understand the true cost of his choices. David's fall from grace has been swift and brutal, but is it enough? Do you think he's truly learned his lesson, or is he just feeling sorry for himself? The moment of truth is coming. When David comes face to face with the woman he destroyed, how do you think Margaret will react? Will she show mercy, or will she make him face the full consequences of his actions? Let me know what you think should happen, and make sure you're subscribed because their confrontation is going to be unlike anything you expect. The International Conference on Pediatric Oncology was held at the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center in Manhattan, 3 years after David Harrison had watched his world crumble around him. Margaret Chin stood at the podium in Conference Room A, looking out at an audience of 800 healthcare professionals from around the world who had come to hear her present her latest research on genetic markers and personalized cancer treatment protocols. She was scheduled to deliver the conference's keynote address, an honor that represented the pinnacle of recognition in her field. The shy, uncertain woman who had once apologized for existing had become someone who commanded respect from internationally renowned oncologists, researchers, and medical professionals. Margaret had no way of knowing that in the audience, seated in the very back row and partially hidden behind a pillar, was a man who had once tried to destroy her. David Harrison looked like a shadow of his former self. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing that hung loosely on his diminished frame. His once pristine appearance showed the wear of someone who had stopped caring about impressions, stopped believing that presentation mattered more than substance. At 61, he looked older than his years, carrying the weight of regret in the slope of his shoulders and the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. He hadn't come to the conference to see Margaret. He had come because he was researching a pro bono case for a small firm where he now worked, representing families who couldn't afford high-powered legal representation, try to rebuild some semblance of meaning from the wreckage of his career. When he saw Margaret's name listed as a keynote speaker, his first instinct had been to leave immediately, but something had kept him frozen in place. Perhaps it was curiosity about who Margaret had become. Perhaps it was masochistic need to witness her success and understand the full scope of what he had lost. Or perhaps, somewhere deep in his damaged soul, it was hope. Hope that seeing her triumph might help him understand how to find redemption for the irredeemable things he had done. Margaret began her presentation with the kind of confidence that comes from absolute mastery of one subject. She spoke about breakthrough treatments, about children who are alive today because of research that hadn't existed 5 years earlier, about the hope that personalized medicine offered to families facing every parent's worst nightmare. When I began this research, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed auditorium, I was motivated by a simple belief that every child deserves the best possible chance at not just surviving cancer, but thriving after treatment. What I discovered was that the key to achieving that goal wasn't just better medications or more aggressive treatment protocols. It was understanding that every child is unique, and their treatment should be as unique as they are. David watched her speak and felt his heart break all over again, but not with self-pity this time. This was a different kind of heartbreak. The devastating recognition of witnessing someone become exactly who they were always meant to be, and knowing that you had tried to prevent it from happening. Margaret's presentation was brilliant, groundbreaking, and deeply moving. She shared case studies of specific children whose lives had been saved by her research, spoke with passion about the collaboration between medical professionals and families, and outlined her vision for the future of pediatric oncology with the kind of moral clarity that had once made David fall in love with her. This was a woman he had dismissed as boring, conventional, unambitious. This was a woman he had publicly humiliated because she wasn't exciting enough for his midlife crisis. This was a woman whose quiet strength and genuine compassion he had traded for fool's gold in the form of a younger, more glamorous woman who had never actually cared about him. When Margaret finished her presentation, the audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. David found himself on his feet as well, clapping until his hands hurt, tears streaming down his face as he watched Margaret accept the recognition she had earned through her own merit, her own dedication, her own refusal to let betrayal define her future. As the audience began to disperse, David knew he should leave. He had no right to approach Margaret, no right to interrupt her moment of triumph with his presence. She had built a beautiful life without him, and he had no business injecting himself into it. But as he watched her surrounded by colleagues and admirers, all eager to discuss her research and explore potential collaborations, David felt a desperate need to somehow acknowledge what she had accomplished, not to ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it, not to try to rebuild their relationship. He knew that was impossible, but simply to tell her that he was proud of her, that he was sorry, and that he finally understood what he had thrown away. David waited until the crowd around Margaret had thinned, until she was gathering her materials from the podium and preparing to leave. His hands shook as he approached her, and he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. Margaret. She froze at the sound of his voice, her back still turned to him. For a moment, David wondered if she would simply walk away without acknowledging his presence. He would have understood if she had. He would have deserved it. But Margaret Chin was not the same woman who had fled from the Plaza Hotel ballroom 3 years earlier. She turned slowly, her face composed and controlled, and met David's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had nothing to fear from ghosts from her past. "David," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here." Up close, David could see how completely Margaret had transformed. She was more beautiful than she had been during their marriage, but it was a different kind of beauty. The kind that comes from living authentically, from pursuing work that matters, from becoming the person you were always meant to be. Her confidence was absolute but not arrogant, her success evident but not ostentatious. "Your presentation was extraordinary," David said, his voice rough with emotion. "The work you're doing, the lives you're saving, I had no idea." Margaret studied his face, taking the changes that 3 years of consequence and regret had wrought. The arrogant, self-satisfied man who had crowned another woman as most beautiful was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely humbled by life's harsh lessons. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's meaningful work." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, surrounded by the detritus of the conference, abandoned coffee cups, scattered programs, the ghosts of all the words they had never been able to say to each other. "Margaret," David began, then stopped, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you—" "You don't owe me anything, David," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "We're divorced. We both moved on. There's nothing between us that requires settling." But David couldn't let it go, couldn't walk away without trying to make her understand how profoundly he regretted the choices that had brought them to this moment. "I was wrong about everything," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "About you, about what mattered, about what I thought I wanted. I threw away the best thing in my life because I was too stupid and selfish to recognize what I had." Margaret's expression didn't change, but David caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps a kind of weary recognition of the pain that comes with learning life's hardest lessons too late. "I know," she said quietly. "I figured that out eventually. Vivian left me," David continued, as if confessing his failures might somehow absolve him of the damage he had caused. "She never loved me. She was just using me to advance her career, and when I stopped being useful to her, she discarded me like I was nothing." Margaret nodded slowly, unsurprised by this revelation. She had known from the beginning what kind of person Vivian was, had recognized the calculated ambition beneath the beautiful exterior. The fact that David had been blind to it until it was too late was his tragedy, not hers. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said, and David could hear that she meant it. Not because she still cared about him romantically, but because Margaret Chin was the kind of person who didn't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, even someone who had caused her tremendous pain. "I lost everything," David said, his voice breaking. "My career, my reputation, any chance at happiness. And the worst part is that I deserved all of it, every single consequence, every moment of regret. I deserved it all for what I did to you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to separate emotion from analysis. "Yes," she said finally, "you did deserve it. But David, you didn't lose everything. You lost the things that were never really yours to begin with. My love was yours, genuinely, for 12 years. But you can't lose someone else's respect and admiration and professional recognition unless you never really earned them in the first place." The observation was devastating in its accuracy. David's success at the law firm had been built on his willingness to prioritize profit over principle, to value image over integrity. Vivian's affection had been conditional from the beginning, based on what he could do for her rather than who he was as a person. Even his sense of self-worth had been dependent on external validation rather than genuine accomplishment. Margaret, by contrast, had built her new life on a foundation of authentic achievement. Her professional recognition was based on work that genuinely helped people. Her confidence came from mastering skills that made a real difference in the world. Her sense of purpose was rooted in something deeper than personal advancement. "I read about your research in the Times," David said. "The article about your work with pediatric cancer patients. I was so proud of you and so ashamed of myself." Margaret's expression softened slightly, not with romantic feeling, but with the kind of compassion she might show to any patient's family member struggling with guilt and regret. "I'm glad you were proud," she said. "But David, your pride doesn't validate my work any more than your disapproval could have invalidated it. I didn't become successful to prove something to you or anyone else. I became successful because I finally learned to value myself enough to pursue work that mattered to me." The lesson was clear, though David wondered if he was capable of learning it at this late stage of his life. Worth and meaning had to come from within, from choices aligned with values, from work that served something greater than ego or ambition. "Can you ever forgive me?" David asked, the question he'd been afraid to voice finally escaping his lips. Margaret considered this carefully, her head tilted slightly as she weighed her response. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said finally. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment was preventing me from becoming who I needed to be. Forgiving you was something I did for myself, not for you." David felt a stab of something that might have been disappointment. He had been hoping, perhaps, that forgiveness might come with some possibility of redemption, some chance to rebuild even a friendship from the wreckage of their marriage. But Margaret wasn't finished. "Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, David. It doesn't mean pretending that what you did was acceptable or that we can somehow return to being important to each other. It means that I've made peace with the past and moved forward with my life." The finality of it was both crushing and, strangely, liberating. Margaret wasn't rejecting him out of ongoing anger or hurt. She was simply being honest about the reality of their situation. They were two people whose lives had briefly intersected, who had caused each other both joy and pain, and who had moved on to become fundamentally different people than they had been when they knew each other. "I want you to know," David said, making one final attempt to somehow matter to the woman he had lost, "that seeing what you've accomplished, understanding who you become, it's helped me realize that maybe it's not too late for me to try to become someone better too." For the first time since David had approached her, Margaret smiled, not with warmth or invitation, but with the kind of polite encouragement she might offer to any stranger who was struggling to find their way. "It's never too late to become who you're supposed to be," she said. "But David, you have to do it for yourself, because it's right, not because you're trying to earn someone else's approval or forgiveness. That's the mistake you made with me and with Vivian. You kept trying to be the person you thought someone else wanted instead of figuring out who you actually were." David nodded, recognizing the truth in her words even as he struggled to understand how to implement them. For so long, his sense of self had been dependent on external validation, professional success, others' admiration, romantic conquest. The idea of building an identity based on internal values rather than external achievements was foreign to him, but he could see that it was the key to the kind of authentic life that Margaret had created for herself. "I should let you go," David said, stepping back to give Margaret space to leave. "Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for forgiving me, even though I didn't earn it. And thank you for showing me what it looks like to build something meaningful from something broken." Margaret gathered her materials and turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at David one final time. David, she said, her voice gentle but clear, I hope you find peace. I hope you find work that matters to you and relationships built on honesty instead of transactions. But mostly, I hope you find yourself. The real you, not the version you think other people want to see. She walked away then, leaving David alone in the empty conference room with the echo of her words and a profound recognition of what unconditional love actually looked like. Margaret's forgiveness hadn't come with conditions or expectations. She hadn't forgiven him because she wanted to rebuild their relationship, or because she needed him to grovel or suffer. She had forgiven him because forgiveness had been necessary for her own growth and healing. It was, David realized, the most generous gift anyone had ever given him. And it was a gift he could only truly receive by learning to forgive himself and commit to becoming the person Margaret believed he was capable of being. As David left the convention center and walked out into the crisp Manhattan evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope that he could somehow undo the damage he had caused or reclaim the life he had thrown away, but hope that he could still build something meaningful from whatever time he had left. 6 months later, David Harrison left his pro bono law practice to join a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to families dealing with pediatric medical crises. The work paid a fraction of what he had once earned at Harrison, Mills and Associates, but it was the first job he had ever taken because he believed it was important rather than because it would advance his career. He never saw or spoke to Margaret again, but he carried the memory of their final conversation with him as a reminder of what authentic success looked like and what kind of person he still might become if he had the courage to keep trying. Margaret Chun continued her groundbreaking research, published dozens of papers that advanced the field of pediatric oncology, and eventually established a foundation that provided funding for experimental treatments for children whose families couldn't afford them. She never remarried, not because she was afraid of love, but because she had learned to be complete within herself and was unwilling to compromise that completeness for anyone who couldn't match her level of authenticity and purpose. Sometimes, late at night, when she was reviewing research data or preparing for conferences, Margaret would think about the conversation with David at the Javits Center, not with regret or longing, but with a kind of peaceful recognition that their story had ended exactly as it needed to, with both of them finally understanding who they were supposed to be. The fairy tale had ended years earlier in that Plaza Hotel ballroom. But the real story, the story of who Margaret became after she stopped trying to be someone else's definition of perfect, was more beautiful than any fairy tale could ever be. And there you have it, a story about betrayal, transformation, and the incredible power of finding yourself after losing everything you thought mattered. Margaret's journey from devastated wife to groundbreaking researcher shows us that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us becomes a catalyst for becoming who we were always meant to be. But what did you think of their final confrontation? Were you surprised by Margaret's response? Did David deserve forgiveness? Or should she have made him suffer more for what he did? And more importantly, what lesson from Margaret's story resonates most with you? If this story moved you, if it made you think about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of reinventing yourself, I need you to do 2 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Second, tell me in the comments, what would you have said to David if you were in Margaret's position? Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. Remember, it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be. Until next time, keep believing in the power of transformation.